Hi, I'm Rashonda Cade. This is Reading with Rashonda. We are reading The Marrow of Tradition by Charles W. Chesnutt. We are starting chapter 2. We are not going to, well, let me keep hope alive. Maybe we'll get through chapter 2. We probably won't, though. So, chapter 2, The Christening Party. They named the Carteret baby Theodore Felix. Theodore was a family name and had been borne by the eldest son for several generations, the major himself being a second son. Having thus given the child two beautiful names, replete with religious and sentimental significance, they called him Dodie. The baby was christened some 6 weeks after its birth, by which time Mrs. Carteret was able to be out. Old Mammy Jane, who had been brought up in the church, but who, like some better informed people in all ages, found religion not inconsistent with the strong vein of superstition, felt her fears for the baby's future much relieved when the rector had made the sign of the cross and sprinkled little Dodie with the water from the carved marble font, which had come from England in the reign of King Charles the Martyr as the ill-fated son of James the First. I don't know if you've ever read any of the oh man, what are they? The Diana Gabaldon books that I love so much, Outlander, the Outlander books. Some of that happens during that time with King Charles and James the First. Anyway, they're talking about the font that was carved from marble, which had come from England in the reign of King Charles the Martyr, as the ill-fated son of James the First was known to St. Andrews. Upon this special occasion, Mammy Jane had been provided with a seat downstairs among the white people, to her own intense satisfaction, and to the secret envy of a small colored attendants in the gallery, to whom she was ostentatiously pointed out by her grandson Jerry, porter at the Morning Chronicle office, who sat among them in the front row. On the following Monday evening, the major gave a christening party in honor of this important event. Owing to Mrs. Carteret's still delicate health, only a small number of intimate friends and family connections were invited to attend. These were the rector of St. Andrews, old Mrs. Polly Ochiltree, the godmother, old Mr. Delamere, a distant relative and also one of the sponsors, and his grandson, Tom Delamere. The major had also invited Lee Ellis, his young city editor, for whom he had a great liking apart from his business value, and who was a frequent visitor at the house. These, with the family itself, which consisted of the major, his wife, and his half sister, Clara Pemberton, a young woman of about 18, made up the 8 persons for whom covers were laid. He has a half sister? Let's keep reading. Ellis was the first to arrive, a tall, loose-limbed young man with a slightly freckled face, hair verging on auburn, a firm chin, and honest gray eyes. He had come half an hour early and was left alone for a few minutes in the parlor, a spacious, high-ceilinged room with large windows and fitted up in excellent taste, with stately reminiscences of a past generation. The walls were hung with figured paper. The ceiling was whitewashed and decorated in the middle with a plaster centerpiece from which hung a massive chandelier sparkling with prismatic rays from 100 crystal pendants. There was a handsome mantel set with terracotta tiles on which fauns and satyrs, nymphs and dryads disported themselves in idyllic abandon. The furniture was old and in keeping with the room. At 7 o'clock, a carriage drove up, from which alighted an elderly gentleman with white hair and mustache, and bowed somewhat with years. Short of breath and painfully weak in the legs, he was assisted from the carriage by a colored man, apparently about 40 years old, to whom short side whiskers and spectacles imparted an air of sobriety. The attendant gave his arm respectfully to the old gentleman, who leaned upon it heavily, but with as little appearance of dependence as possible. The servant, assuming a similar unconsciousness of the weight resting upon his arm, assisted the old gentleman carefully up the steps. "I'm all right now, Sandy," whispered the gentleman as soon as his feet were planted firmly on the piazza. "You may come back for me at 9 o'clock." Having taken his hand from his servant's arm, he advanced to meet a lady who stood in the door awaiting him, a tall, elderly woman, gaunt and angular of frame, with a mottled face and high cheekbones, partially covered by bands of hair entirely too black and abundant for a person of her age, if one might judge from the lines of her mouth, which are rarely deceptive in such matters. Okay, like the lines of my mouth. I guess they're talking about my age too, and the lines around my eyes and the lines across my forehead. I do some face yoga from time to time, though, like face exercises. I feel like it helps. Anyway, let's keep reading. Perhaps you'd better not send your man away, Mr. Delamere, observed the lady in a high, shrill voice which grated upon the old gentleman's ears. He was slightly hard of hearing, but, like most deaf people, resented being screamed at. You might need him before 9 o'clock. One never knows what may happen after one has had the second stroke. And moreover, our butler has fallen down the back steps. Negroes are so careless. And sprained his ankle so that he can't stand. I'd like to have Sandy stay and wait on the table in Peter's place if you don't mind. Ah, so she started off with, you might want to have your servant stay nearby because you might need him, but then we find out what's really going on is her butler's not able to be there. So since you brought a servant with you, he can just be our butler for the night. No big. So we'll continue. I thank you, Mrs. Ochiltree, for your solicitude, replied Mr. Delamere with a shade of annoyance in his voice. But my health is very good just at present, and I do not anticipate any catastrophe which will require my servant's presence before I am ready to go home. But I have no doubt, madam, he continued with a courteous inclination, that Sandy will be pleased to serve you if you desire it, to the best of his poor knowledge. I shall be honored, ma'am, assented Sandy with a bow even deeper than his master's. Only I'm feared I ain't rightly dressed for to wait on table. I was only going to prayer meeting, and so I didn't put on my best clothes. If Miss Ochiltree ain't going to need me for the next 15 minutes, I can ride back home and in the carriage and dress myself suitable for the occasion, sir. If you think you'll wait on the table any better, said Mrs. Ochiltree, you may go along and change your clothes. But hurry back, for it is 7 now, and dinner will soon be served. I'm thinking and feeling things. I'm trying to comport myself. I'm going to keep reading, and we'll see if I determine I have something to say. Sandy retired with a bow. While descending the steps to the carriage which had waited for him, he came face to face with a young man just entering the house. Am I in time for dinner, Sandy? Asked the newcomer. Yes, Master Tom, you're in plenty of time. Dinner won't be ready till I get back, which won't be for 15 minutes or so yet. Throwing away the cigarette which he held between his fingers, the young man crossed the piazza with a light step and, after a preliminary knock for an answer to which he did not wait, entered the house with the air of one thoroughly at home. The lights in the parlor had been lit, and Ellis, who sat talking to Major Carteret when the newcomer entered, covered him with a jealous glance. Slender and of medium height, with a small head of almost perfect contour, a symmetrical face, dark almost to swarthiness, black eyes which moved somewhat restlessly, curly hair of raven tint, a slight mustache, small hands and feet, and fashionable attire, Tom Delamere, the grandson of the old gentleman who had already arrived, was easily the handsomest young man in Wellington. But no discriminating observer would have characterized his beauty as manly. It conveyed no impression of strength, but did possess a certain element feline rather than feminine, which subtly negatived the idea of manliness. Okay, I'm moving on from what I was thinking before, but what an interesting description. Slender and of medium height, so he's thin and not tall, a small head of almost perfect contour. I mean, I know what those words mean, but like, I guess he had just a really nice shaped head, a symmetrical face, unlike Tom Cruise, dark almost to swarthiness. So, swarthiness is, I mean, it's dark, it's brown, it's tan. A lot of times, especially back in these days, people might have described it as Spanish or Italian, but also sometimes code for people of color who could pass as white. Black eyes, curly hair of raven tint. Like I have questions about Tom's lineage, is all I'm saying, based on all of this. And very interesting that he's described pretty androgynous. He's certainly not masculine, but he's more cat like rather than feminine. I am intrigued by these descriptions of Tom. We will keep reading. He gave his hand to the major, nodded curtly to Ellis, saluted his grandfather respectfully, and inquired for the ladies. Olivia is dressing for dinner, replied the major. Mrs. Ochiltree is in the kitchen, struggling with the servants. Clara, here she comes now. Ellis, whose senses were preternaturally acute where Clara was concerned, was already looking toward the hall and was the first to see her. Clad in an evening gown of simple white to the close fitting corsage of which she had fastened a bunch of pink roses, she was to Ellis a dazzling apparition. To him, her erect and well molded form was the embodiment of symmetry, her voice sweet music, her movements the perfection of grace, and it scarcely needed a lover's imagination to read in her fair countenance a pure heart and a high spirit, the truthfulness that scorns a lie, the pride which is not haughtiness. There were suggestive depths of tenderness, too, in the curl of her lip, the droop of her long lashes, the glance of her blue eyes, depths that Ellis had long since divined, though he had never yet explored them. Oh my. She gave Ellis a friendly nod as she came in, but for the smile with which she greeted Delamere, Ellis would have given all that he possessed. Not a great deal, it is true, but what could a man do more? You are the last one, Tom, she said reproachfully. Mr. Ellis has been here half an hour. Delamere threw a glance at Ellis, which was not exactly friendly. Why would this fellow always be on hand to emphasize his own shortcomings? The rector is not here, answered Tom triumphantly. You see, I am not the last. The rector, replied Clara, was called out of town at 6 o'clock this evening to visit a dying man, and so he cannot be here. You are the last, Tom, and Mr. Ellis was the first. Ellis was ruefully aware that this comparison in his favor was the only visible advantage that he had gained from his early arrival. He had not seen Miss Pemberton a moment sooner by reason of it. There had been a certain satisfaction in being in the same house with her, but Delamere had arrived in time to share, or more correctly, to monopolize the sunshine of her presence. So we have Clara Pemberton has two love interests, Tom Delamere and Mr. Ellis. Let's see what plays out. Delamere gave a plausible excuse which won Clara's pardon, and another enchanting smile which pierced Ellis like a dagger. He knew very well that Delamere's excuse was a lie. Ellis himself had been ready as early as 6 o'clock, but judging this to be too early, had stopped in at the Clarendon Club for half an hour to look over the magazines. While coming out, he had glanced into the card room where he had seen his rival deep in a game of cards from which Delamere had evidently not been able to tear himself until the last moment. He had accounted for his lateness by a story quite inconsistent with these facts. The two young people walked over to a window on the opposite side of the large room where they stood talking to one another in low tones. The major had left the room for a moment. Old Mr. Delamere, who was watching his grandson and Clara with an indulgent smile, proceeded to rub salt into Ellis's wounds. They make a handsome couple, he observed. I remember well when her mother, in her youth an ideally beautiful woman of an excellent family, married Daniel Pemberton, who was not of so good a family, but had made money. The major, who was only a very young man then, disapproved of the match. He considered that his mother, although a widow and nearly 40, was marrying beneath her, but he had been a good brother to Clara and a careful guardian of her estate. Ah, young gentlemen, you cannot appreciate, except in imagination, what it means to one standing on the brink of eternity to feel sure that he will live on in his children and his children's children. Um, I'm just looking to see if there's a good place to stop soon. It's been 15 minutes. And not that we can't keep going. We usually go for like 20. Last time it was like 30, but I'm just looking to see if there's a natural stopping point before the end of the chapter. There doesn't appear to be one. We'll keep reading. Ellis was appreciating at that moment what it meant in cold blood, with no effort of the imagination, to see the girl whom he loved absorbed completely in another man. She had looked at him only once since Tom Delamere had entered the room, and then merely to use him as a spur with which to prick his favored rival. Yes, sir, he returned mechanically. Miss Clara is a beautiful young lady. And Tom is a good boy, a fine boy, returned the old gentleman. I am very well pleased with Tom and shall be entirely happy when I see them married. What? Ellis could not echo this sentiment. The very thought of this marriage made him miserable. He had always understood that the engagement was merely tentative, a sort of family understanding subject to confirmation after Delamere should have attained his majority, which was still a year off, and when the major should think Clara old enough to marry. Ellis saw Delamere with the eye of a jealous rival and judged him mercilessly, whether correctly or not. The sequel will show. He did not at all believe that Tom Delamere would make a fit husband for Clara Pemberton, but his opinion would have had no weight. He could hardly have expressed it without showing his own interest. Moreover, there was no element of the sneak in Lee Ellis's makeup. The very fact that he might profit by the other's discomfiture left Delamere secure, so far as he could be affected by anything that Ellis might say. But Ellis did not shrink from a fair fight, and though in this one the odds were heavily against him, yet so long as the engagement remained indefinite, so long indeed as the object of his love was still unwed, he would not cease to hope. He was like, I don't even care if she gets engaged as long as she's not married yet. I'm still going to shoot my shot. I appreciate that. Even though he also said he didn't want his intentions to be known. So I don't know what to do with that. Let's keep reading. Such a sacrifice as this marriage clearly belonged in the catalog of impossibilities. Ellis had not lived long enough to learn that impossibilities are merely things of which we have not learned or which we do not wish to happen. Sandy returned at the end of a quarter an hour, and dinner was announced. Mr. Delamere led the way to the dining room with Mrs. Ochiltree. Tom followed with Clara. The major went to the head of the stairs and came down with Mrs. Carteret upon his arm, her beauty rendered more delicate by the pallor of her countenance, and more complete by the happiness with which it glowed. Ellis went in alone. Wah wah. In the record's absence, it was practically a family party which sat down, with the exception of Ellis, who, as we have seen, would willingly have placed himself in the same category. The table was tastefully decorated with flowers which grew about the house in lavish profusion. In warm climates, nature adorns herself with true feminine vanity. What a beautiful table! Exclaimed Tom before they were seated. The decorations are mine, said Clara proudly. I cut the flowers and arranged them all myself. Which accounts for the admirable effect, rejoined Tom with a bow, before Ellis, to whom the same thought had occurred, was able to express himself. He had always counted himself the least envious of men, but for this occasion he coveted Tom Delamere's readiness. The beauty of the flowers, observed old Mr. Delamere with sententious gallantry, is reflected upon all around them. It is a handsome company. Mrs. Ochiltree beamed upon the table with a dry smile. I don't perceive any effect that it has upon you or me, she said. And as for the young people, handsome is as handsome does. If Tom here, for instance, were as good as he looks, you flatter me, Aunt Polly, Tom broke in hastily, anticipating the crack of the whip. He was familiar with his aunt's conversational idiosyncrasies. He was like, my auntie is about to throw me under the bus. Let me stop that. All right, we'll keep reading. If you are as good as you look, continued the old lady with a cunning but indulgent smile, someone has been slandering you. Thanks, Aunt Polly. Now you don't flatter me. There is Mr. Ellis, Mrs. Ochiltree went on, who is not half so good looking, but is steady as a clock, I dare say. Now, Aunt Polly, interposed Mrs. Carteret, let the gentleman alone. She doesn't mean half what she says, continued Mrs. Carteret apologetically, and only talks that way to people whom she likes. We'll stop there. So we read about half of chapter 2. We are reading The Marrow of Tradition by Charles Waddell Chesnutt. I'm Rashonda Cade, and this is Reading with Rashonda. Until next time.